Let me know where you're from. We've done that already, but still, if you have, if you want to share after that nonsense, I'd be very happy to hear and to see where y'all are from. Uh, Wonderful. Illinois, Wisconsin, Louisiana, Colorado, Orange County, Virginia. Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. So, what we are doing today, I'm giving you a little sneak peek into a new course, and I'm teaching you how to use Cadence to write an emotionally riveting story. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about the St. Basil Workshop, some news and application tips. I see at least one of you here has applied before, so will be especially useful for you. And we will have a Q&A afterwards as well. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicholas Kotar, and other than being harried and terrible with presenter mode in PowerPoint, I am an award-winning author of 7 epic fantasy books inspired by Russian fairy tales and Russian epic poetry. I'm also currently writing my first sci-fi novel, Cantos of Arcadia, and I'm very, very excited about where that novel is going. In addition to my work as an author, I'm also the dean of St. Basil Writers Workshop, a 9-month Orthodox creative writing program with instruction from Paul Kingsnorth, Jonathan Pajot, ancient faith editor and author Catherine Bolger Hyde, and writer and podcaster Nicole Rokas. I'll share more about this program at the end of tonight's webinar, and I will leave you plenty of time for questions. But first, let's get into today's topic. The secret of using Cadence to write an emotionally riveting story. Well, first, actually, let's start with a concept from Marketing 101. Any marketing professional will tell you that the first rule of selling anything, no matter what it is, and unfortunately, selling is what we all have to do, even as writers. But the first thing you need to do is to know what the other person wants to buy. And sometimes it's not even a thing. It could be an experience, it could be a state of mind, it could be an emotion. So that might sound a little bit silly to think about selling emotions, but that really is what's going on here. And only when you figure out what a person wants, only then can you figure out how to create and position a product or service that appeals to that particular need. Anybody who studied marketing at all, you understand this. This is a pretty core concept. Now, if you don't know who your audience is, what they want, or why they want it, you'll be talking past them and they won't be really listening at all. Think of Dale Carnegie's popular book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Terrible title, but very effective. Over 16 million copies sold. And part of the book's success is due to its very simple, yet often overlooked concept. Thinking not of what you want, but of what the other person wants and needs before you position what it is that you have to offer. But why am I talking about marketing when this webinar is supposed to be about writing? Let me be clear. I am not trying to suggest that you need to figure out some formula to trick people into reading your story. Although some people will, in fact, tell you to do that. After all, I'm not here to teach you how to write cheap romance novels to feed an addicted audience. In fact, that you will hear that kind of advice from a lot of people. I feel very strongly that that's not what we're here to do as storytellers. I'm here, hopefully, to help you write deeply rooted stories that are transformative for your readers and for you as a writer, because even the writing of such transformative stories can have an effect on the writer as well as the reader. So why are we talking about this marketing mumbo jumbo? Well, I'm not saying you should write your entire story based on what appeals to an ideal reader, that you can't possibly know who that reader is until you've actually written the thing. And yes, turns out that we're just a hamster riding in a wheel. No, I'm suggesting that any writer worth his salt should ask himself one question. Why do readers read? After all, I'm hoping you want people to read your story, right? So what is it that makes a story interesting? Let's try a quick thought experiment. Think of your favorite novel, or It could be your favorite movie or TV show. That's fine. What is it about that book, movie, TV show that draws you in? And if you want to type in your answers to the chat box, please do. I'd love to hear your answers. For me, well, it's up there. Chronicles of Narnia. What is it that draws me in? It's the idea of there being an entirely different world that follows a different set of rules for time and space, and it is right under my very nose. And I have to be childlike to get in. I think that's a fantastic idea because as I'm sure you all do, in quiet moments when nobody's particularly looking at you, you lament the loss of childhood, that simplicity, that wonderful awe that we had, that magic that seemed to suffuse everything, absolutely everything around us. Well, most often the answer to why or what it is about that story that draws us in has to do with an experience that the reader enters into. In other words, the investment you feel in the characters you're reading about. I talked about the world, but the world by itself is not as interesting as the fawn carrying a bunch of Christmas presents and serving you tea under a lamppost in the middle of a snowy wood. The world is fine, but when it's populated by characters that move you through that world, then you have something extremely special. So if you want your story to hook people and to transform them, both, because that's what we're talking about. We're not simply talking about hooking people for the sake of selling 16 million copies of this or that or other or becoming rich in the process. No, that's not why we're here. We're here to learn how to tell the kinds of stories that made us in childhood feel that wonder. So if you want to do that, if you want to transform your readers, if you want to give them a deeper sense and understanding of what it is to be truly human, you have to get past the didactic part of your brain. That little annoying critical voice that's constantly telling you, don't read that nonsense. It's for children. Because, by the way, this is what fiction is all about. It's all about getting past that annoying gatekeeper and going to where the fun is. And by the way, that fun, that's where the real transformation can happen. We want our stories to hook people and go straight to their heart, to create strong emotional connections between the reader and the characters that we create. Because if we don't create that emotional bond, if our characters do not come across as real living people, you can forget about keeping your reader around long enough to get to the really deep, transformative things you're writing about. And sure, there are examples of transformative books and wonderful novels where it's the story or the world that carries the reader through. But in those cases, you have some truly transformative talents doing things that are very difficult to do. But how much more effective it is if you can have the strong connection with a character, because this is how actually in real life we have transformative relationships, not by thinking about love, but by actually being in love. And don't be fooled. The kind of relationships we can forge with characters in books, in a lot of ways, of course, they're not the same as having real relationships. But in the absence of having, in some cases, when we're having a down time in our life, when we don't have any friends, when we find ourselves in a place that is difficult, when we've been abandoned, when we've been divorced, those relationships that we can create with those characters in books can be extremely powerful and extremely transformative. That's what we're here to discuss today, how to create those characters that grab your reader by the throat and won't let them go until the very last word of the very last page. And guess what? It's a win-win, because if your characters are that alive, they won't let you, the writer, go either. They might not even let you stop writing so you can eat lunch or use the bathroom. Yes, it becomes a problem sometimes, which means you'll finally have the zeal it takes to finish writing that novel you've put on the back burner for maybe a year, maybe 5 years, maybe a decade, and to see you through the messy middle of the novel where everybody hits slumps and roadblocks. It's inevitable. Now, especially if you are actively writing already, but feel like you've hit a wall and don't know where your story is going, this webinar will help you. Often it's not a problem with the story. Very often it's a problem with character. That's the great thing about creating characters who are emotionally real. First of all, to you, the author, it's like they become alive and get on your team and help you solve the plot issues that you face along the way, because it's almost like they have their own will and their own ideas of what should happen. And by the way, whenever that happens, and those of you who have been writing for any period of time will know what I'm talking about, at least a little bit. And you will know that when the characters start doing things on their own, that's when the story really begins to take off. And oftentimes your readers will tell you that section, I loved it. It was like the story just flew off on its own. And you don't have to tell them. You could just quietly chuckle and say, yeah, that's when the character decided to go his or her own way. So if you can figure out how to motivate your characters in such a way, they'll soon be motivating you to sit down and write. Let's look at some of the concepts we'll be going into detail during my Motivating Your Lazy Characters course, which is starting next week. So, how do you create emotionally interesting characters? Well, let's start by looking at the structural patterns that talented novelists and real craftsmen use to draw their readers into their characters' emotions. For this webinar, as a disclaimer, I'll be borrowing from Dwight Swain's fantastic book, Techniques of the Selling Writer, and Randy Ingermanson's advanced fiction writing blog. Any effective novel, by which we mean a novel that engages your reader's emotions, has a cadence to it, a rhythm. This cadence can be described as alternating two types of scenes. Now, this can get a little bit confusing because we have to understand what we mean by the word scene. Dwight Swain, in his wonderful book, calls these two alternating kinds of scenes and sequels. It's especially confusing because they're both, in effect, scenes. So we might call one, the scene, an action beat or an action scene, and the other one we might call a reflection scene. An action scene is when your main character or point of view character, the one your audience sees your fictional world through, the one through whose eyes we are seeing everything, the ones whose emotions we are feeling most directly, and therefore the one we are identifying with most deeply. By the way, it doesn't necessarily mean we like this character, but we can talk more about that later. In an action scene, your point of view character has a goal. The scene shows that a character trying to attain his or her goal, but since it's a good story that actually has a plot line and isn't all rainbows and unicorns, something has to get in the way of your character attaining that goal. And that's where your story starts to get interesting. Your character fights against whatever stands between him and his goal, and that creates conflict, which drives a reader's emotional investment. Because if you've set it up correctly, and if you're really deeply within the point of view of that character, just the mere suggestion of a conflict is enough to make your heart squeeze a little bit. And because that conflict, of course, is not easily resolved, you being excellent writers know that the conflict must seem impossible inside the scene. Because that conflict isn't easily resolved and your book doesn't wrap up within a single scene, your character not only doesn't win the conflict, your character fails miserably. So the scene must end in disaster for the main character, by which we mean that the main character is prevented, foiled in trying to achieve his goal. Maybe they attain part of their goal, maybe not. Either way, the character is faced with an evolving challenge that stands between her and happiness. So what happens after this disaster? Well, this is actually a very important point that a lot of, especially beginning writers, forget about. In real life, when something terrible happens to us, we do not usually jump from the disaster immediately into another moment of action. Let's say in our own lives, we've just been gone through a difficult breakup. The next thing we do is probably not pick up the phone and call our ex to go out with her or him. If we do, there's going to be a quick disaster soon after that. Most of the time, though, if we go through a difficult breakup, you're going to need some time to reflect, to think, and to process about what happens, to strategize how to overcome this disaster that stands between him or her and the goal, the obstacle that we were left with at the end of the last scene, the temporary failure of all your plans. Now, you might have already noted that we need to get a little bit more specific about what kind of goals we're talking about. Note that there are macro and micro goals. For example, Frodo's macro goal in The Lord of the Rings is to destroy the ring. It is the goal that unifies the entire story for Frodo throughout the entire book. But along the way, he has constant smaller goals: getting to Bree, getting to Weathertop, getting to Rivendell. It's a quest. Most of the goals are going to be actually moving somewhere. Now, even when he does accomplish one of those micro goals that keep bringing him closer to the macro goal, the stakes keep rising because actually, once he seems to achieve the goal that he had set for himself, he actually fails. Let's take, for example, Bree. And let's not look at Bree the way it was in the movies. It wasn't quite correctly shown because when he comes to Bree, the initial sense is not one of disaster. In the movies, Bree is a menacing place with a lot of very large people drinking beer and leering at the hobbits with their huge faces. Famously, it's one of the only scenes where Peter Jackson shows up as a cameo, by the way, but that's neither here nor there. But if you look in the book, the macro goal is to get to Bree. Why? Because Gandalf is supposed to be there, and we're supposed to get our next direction. What are we going to do with the ring? Because we don't know through the eyes of Frodo what it is that we're supposed to be doing. So he comes to Bree. Okay, goal accomplished. Actually, no, because we find out that nobody knows where Gandalf is. So coming to Bree has been a failure. So there needs to be a moment where Frodo and then his new friend Strider, who ends up being Aragorn, son of Arathorn, have to go through a bit of an introspection period that is heightened by the presence and soon to be coming of the ring wraiths, that raises the tension even while we are going through a period of introspection. And so the stakes keep rising. They keep getting bigger and bigger because the conflicts put him in increasingly grave peril. For example, in Bree, we see what the Nazgul are capable of when they attack the room with the pillows and they tear them up into pieces. So we know that that's something that's waiting for Frodo. So when he gets to Weathertop, a version of that happens when he actually gets stabbed. All the while, he still hasn't achieved his macro goal. He hasn't destroyed the ring. If he had, the book would be over. The structure helps you intensify your reader's investment along the journey. It's also an accurate representation of real life. And this is what makes this kind of writing so effective, is it mirrors the way that we tend to go through life. We have little goals that very often we do not fully accomplish. And in the not fully accomplishing of it, we have a slight mini disaster that reorients our positioning with regard to the world. And so we have to think about it. We have to create a new set of parameters, and we have to come up with a new goal, always moving forward. After every action scene, we have a reflection scene, or what Dwight Swain calls a sequel. You can't just repeat an action scene because your character ended the last scene foiled and exhausted. He needs a chance to think. Think of this cadence of action and reflection like exercise. If you run a marathon, you don't start a new race as soon as you reach the finish line. Believe me, you don't. You stretch, you eat a burger, you sleep 12 hours, you recover for a few days, then find a new race to sign up for and begin conditioning all over again. This is true. I do it all the time for adventure racing. The same goes for your characters. They don't jump straight back into action after a disaster. Or take even a more immediate example. Let's say that the story is about a boxer, and the boxer is going to defend his title against an unknown fighter who's smaller and less physically impressive at first glance than he is. But during the course of the fight, the unknown challenger ends up having tremendous speed and excellent technique, and he knocks out the hero. Now, the hero couldn't possibly, in the next scene, challenge the new champion because he is physically battered. So whether he wants to or not, he must rest. Otherwise, he will die. If he goes back straight into the ring, there is a chance that he will be killed. So instead, we have a reaction. The reaction shows your point of view character processing the disaster that just happened. But the character, they can't stay here forever. They have to decide what to do next. There generally aren't a lot of great options after disasters. We know this. But you, as an author, have to find some creative way to help your character pick up the pieces and move forward in a new direction. Now, this is the dilemma. It cannot be the same direction as before because that would be foolish and it would have the same disaster as the result. You have to allow for the dilemma to give the point of view character time and motivation to assess the options that he or she has and come to a decision about what he will do next. Let's take the example of the boxer, for example. The boxer, as in all the Rocky movies, needs to recuperate physically. But in the process of physical recuperation, there is an emotional component to the dilemma and decision. And oftentimes, that is the most interesting part of the sequel. Because in that sequel, we have all kinds of emotional trouble that the character has to go through, very often involving people that the character loves. So in the Rocky movies, this often happens. And in fact, in Creed 3, which was an interesting movie because it was so different from all the rest of the Rocky movies, this happens in a very effective way. When Adonis Creed gets knocked out by a character who has a very, very strong emotional hold on him because of a childhood connection, what ends up happening is that during the dilemma process, he fights with his wife. And his decision to have to come back into the ring and then defeat both his inner dragon and the outer dragon of the challenger can only happen after he heals the relationship with his wife. Because that is an external manifestation of the cracks that are going on inside his own soul. That's where truly transcendent and beautiful fiction really happens. Because this dilemma decision movement must generate a new goal. And boom, as soon as we do that, we're back to an action scene. Now, this action reflection scene sequel cadence continues again and again and again until your character achieves the ultimate goal and your reader can finally feel at peace enough to put the finished book down. Probably emotionally exhausted, but grateful to have made such an epic journey with this wonderful character. Of course, if you're writing a tragedy, your story might not end with the attainment of the final goal, but it will end with a conclusion, whether happy or sad, a conclusion that allows for the reader once and for all to have emotional closure and to know whether the goal has been achieved or what the result is. I can't really imagine a boxing movie that would end with the main character dying, but I suppose it could happen. In any case, let's stick with the positive ending. In Creed 3, this is done absolutely beautifully because the final fight is choreographed in such a way that the battle between the two characters is going on almost entirely inside their heads. So at a certain point, after we get the obligatory action scenes, the really wonderfully choreographed stuff that you expect from every Rocky movie, you have the middle section, the boring middle that everybody usually kind of snoozes during, the tunes out during. All of the audience disappears. The lighting dims, and it is as if the two protagonists, the two characters, are physically destroying each other with nobody else there other than the two of them. They're yelling at each other, they're pounding at each other, and it is clear that this is all about working through inner demons for both of them. And so at the end of it, when the good guy, Adonis Creed, defeats the bad guy, because this conflict is less about good versus evil and much more about fighting one's inner demons, then the loss for the character who is the foil to Adonis Creed is less tragic than it is cathartic. So this character who went through many years of prison and finally reaches his stated goal of becoming the heavyweight champion of the world by defeating Adonis Creed, in the end is actually ready to make peace with Adonis for a childhood betrayal, even after he is defeated in the boxing ring. And that can only become possible as a result of the dilemma, the reaction dilemma and decision on Adonis Creed's part, making this a fight that is less about the external validation of winning the heavyweight title and a lot more about overcoming one's inner demons and allowing for healing to happen after catharsis. Now, note what happens if you have nothing but action scenes. Think of the most boring action movie you ever watched, one that has almost zero character development and is instead filled with flying objects, smashed cars, really bad CGI, and cinematography where everything is blurry. I could think of a whole bunch of them, especially the Transformer movies. For me, that's Transformer. You leave the theater absolutely dazed, your adrenaline is high, so that you're overstimulated and emotionally completely shut down, with no choice but to take an ibuprofen and try to forget as quickly as possible what you saw, preferably in a tub of ice cream. Not much of a story. On the other hand, a story that is all introspection and navel gazing, 20th century literary fiction, leaves you emotionally drained and nauseous. And you have no choice but to take an ibuprofen and forget what you read, preferably at the bottom of a fantastic tub of ice cream. Also, not much of a story. It really is all about the balance. Now, experiencing this tug and pull, this swing back and forth of action and reflection, of disasters, foiled goals, and new strategies, new energy to obtain those goals, this is what engages a reader's emotions. Why? Because it's what we go through in our own lives. And how much better to experience the most cathartic, difficult kinds of disasters and reflections when we don't actually have to go through it ourselves, when we can go through it vicariously by seeing it through the eyes of another. This is the structure that keeps you firmly inside the character's inner world and keeps you emotionally invested and glued to the page. Yes, this is usually the formula that is recommended for commercial fiction. However, you will find this kind of balance, action, reflection, even in classic literature that would seem in some cases to be nothing but introspection. I'm particularly thinking of someone like Jane Austen. Note that we talked about large-scale story structure above, how to sequence and alternate the types of scenes you write about to keep your readers engaged from one chapter to the next. This is how the book is supposed to be structured. Now, what we didn't talk about is the small-scale structure of individual scenes. How to move your readers from paragraph to paragraph, not from chapter to chapter, but even from sentence to sentence, while keeping them firmly stuck inside the point of view character's experience of the world in an engaging way. Just as there's a formula for writing a novel with an engaging cadence, there's also a formula for writing a scene that feels right to readers, a scene that is so engaging that they stay in the story and they want to read the next sentence and the next sentence and the next. Writing an emotionally engaging scene is one of the topics that I'll cover in detail in my Motivate Your Lazy Characters course this October. And suffice it to say that in order to write a book that engages a reader's emotions, both at the large scale structure of the book and at the small scale structure of each individual scene, everything comes down to the characters. You need to know who your characters are, what their goals are, and this is different from what their goals are, what motivates them. Those are two different things. Before you'll even know how they'll act or then react to any given disaster or situation. That's where we'll start in my course, Motivating Your Lazy Characters. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this course. This is a live course, where it's going to be live in October 2023, taught by me throughout the month of October. I have two main goals for you. To help you create characters that grab both you and your reader by the throat and won't let go. When you have strong characters, your story will almost write itself. My second goal is to help prepare you to apply, if you want, for the St. Basil Writers Workshop, which had an off year this year, meaning we didn't have an incoming cohort, and we are resuming admissions in fall, or rather, we are resuming admissions in January to start in fall 2024. I'll talk more about this later, but it's a 9-month creative writing program with instruction from me, Jonathan Pajot, Paul Kingsnorth, Ancient Faith fiction editor Catherine Bolger Hyde, and Dr. Nicole Rokas. And there's a bonus goal. Why are we doing this in October? If you've ever wanted to participate in NaNoWriMo, and yes, it is a lot of fun, this course will help prep your story perfectly so that you can just get down to the writing and put down those 1,667 words a day that you need to get 50,000 by the end of November. This is what we're going to be teaching. In week 1, we're going to talk about what is GMC. No, it's not a car. Learn what it is and why your characters really need it. In week 2, we're going to talk about the difference between goals and motivations. It's going to be a deep dive. Learn why and how they're different and why both are absolutely necessary to crafting the perfect antagonist to your hero or the hero to your antagonist, depending on how you're looking at it. Week 3 is going to be a user's guide to GMC charts. GMC charts were for me almost a panacea, the universal fixer of all problems. And I say this almost unreservedly. Whenever I have trouble in my story, I immediately go to a GMC chart and I almost immediately figure out what I was doing wrong. Learn how to use these GMC charts at different stages of the writing process so that your novel, and more importantly, you yourself, do not lose steam. And in week 4, the final week, we're going to learn the difference in more detail between scenes and sequels. We're going to break down how each one of the 3 aspects of both scenes and sequels work. We're going to talk about something called motivation and reaction units that are going to help you craft the best kind of scenes as well as the best kind of sequels to motivate those lazy characters of yours. This course, in its first iteration, will be taught live by me with weekly sessions that we will schedule to accommodate as many of you as we can, with same-day replays available for those who can't attend live. This is a full class experience, which means we'll be building community with each other also as we go along. We have a designated course forum, an online space that is exclusively for you, where you can ask me anything at any time, and I will answer. I'll be giving you assignments to complete each week so you can apply class concepts to your own story, and I'll also be giving some homework feedback via video postings that will be available to everyone so that we can all learn from each other. Now, if you're sensitive and you want a particular critique to be done in private, I can do that as well. But I do recommend that you be brave and allow me to critique you publicly, because I do it with love. And very often it is from the mistakes of others that we learn about our own mistakes and how to fix them. You'll also be encouraged to build community with one another throughout the week when we're not meeting for classes. There will be discussion prompts, where you can share thoughts, questions, ideas, goals, etc., to build bonds and accountability structures with this new writing community. Go to subscribepage.io/motivating your lazy characters to enroll today. Anna will put the link in the chat. Why am I asking you to enroll today? Because if you do, you will get a special discount that is only available today until midnight. The normal price of this course is $149. If you buy it by the end of tonight and use code 25OFF, I will take 25% off your order. The early bird pricing for this course has expired, but I'm offering a special 25% discount for attendees of this webinar if you sign up now or before midnight tonight. Now, let's get to the bigger picture. I said earlier that this course is designed in part to help prep you for the same Basil Writers Workshop. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that now. The idea for this workshop came about quite spectacularly. My wife was in labor. So as she is in labor for our 4th child, I get a call from a mutual friend who, in the middle of her having contractions, says to me, "Tell me your dream for setting up a writing structure for others. Tell me what your dream is. What do you want to do with your gift of writing? Whatever that dream is, I will make it happen." And so I had to kind of turn to my wife and say, "Look, I'll call you back." But it's completely not by accident that the idea came to life, was born on the same day as my fourth child, because it really is like another child for me. St. Basil Writers Workshop is what I want it to be the next generation, the creator of the next generation of the heirs of the Inklings. This is the place to go if you want to write in the tradition of Tolkien and Lewis. Our mission is to prepare a generation of writers to respond to the acute cultural need for restorative, positive, transformative stories. Now, it's designed not for beginners, for advanced beginning and early intermediate fiction and narrative nonfiction writers. This workshop helps writers hone their craft to connect with today's readers using time tested techniques that infuse their words and worlds with the heartbeat of reality. Not only that, but we want to push you over that hump and get you by the end of your year at St. Basil's to a point where you can publish a complete work, whether it's a short story, a novella, or even a complete novel. Because together with Dostoevsky, we really believe that beauty will save the world. St. Basil Writers Workshop is a 9-month writing program that begins with an in person retreat in August. And by the way, that is the best part of the whole thing. After which, all the courses are going to be hosted online. Admission is capped at 12 students per year. We're doing this very intentionally because the small group size allows for us to give you personalized mentorship and also allows for you within the community to create a very tight bond. The instructors are truly out of this world. Well, except for one in the middle who's terrible with technology, but never mind. They are Paul Kingsnorth, Jonathan Pajot, Catherine Bolger Hyde, Dr. Nicole Rokas, and moi. Here's what our graduates of the first year of the St. Basil's Workshop have to say. Nathan says, writing for me is no longer a possibility, but a reality. I've had a clear picture of the story I'm writing for a long time now, but the St. Basil Writers Workshop has given me a clearer approach on how I should write it. It has done more good for me than all my years in college combined, especially in writing fiction. And Steve has said, the St. Basil Workshop has been very influential. I'm essentially restarting my main project from scratch, checking my new version against class notes and recordings. Both the depth of storytelling and the tactical techniques far exceeded my expectations. I've already been recommending the program. I genuinely think the course was completely worth the time, effort, and tuition. The depth of material presented is really not something I found anywhere else. Brittany says, each class has left me feeling more free to write in a way that felt real and natural. I now feel more capable as a writer, and I find that I don't get stuck as often. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I've gotten more accomplished creatively this year than I have in the last decade combined, and I don't believe I'd be where I am now without the St. Basil Workshop. I'm almost finished with my first novella, and so many ideas are flowing, I almost can't keep track. I feel like a writing career isn't just a fun thought or dream, but a very real and practical possibility for me now. 100% would recommend St. Basil's Workshop. For writers and storytellers, the instruction received and connection made were priceless. I feel like I can write again, and I don't know how I would have gotten to this point were it not for the workshop and the grace of God. Want to join us? I would if I was a writer. Our next cohort will begin in fall 2024. Applications will open in early 2023. To stay updated on workshop news and important events, I invite you to sign up for St. Basil's mailing list. Simply go to our new, shiny, fancy webpage, stbasilwriters.com, and we'll put that link into the chat. Scroll down and enter your email under Join Our Mailing List. Again, I want to emphasize that, and some of you in this room today with me at this webinar have submitted applications in the past. And I really want to emphasize to you that this course, Motivating Your Lazy Characters, is designed in large part to help you strengthen your writing skills enough so that you have a leg up when applying to the workshop. We'll be offering more of these mini courses throughout this year for those who want a taste of what the workshop will be like and also want to strengthen their chances of admittance for fall 2024. So stay tuned. I'd love to hear from you after me talking for a little while. So let's open up the floor for questions. Get rid of that PowerPoint presentation. Anna, if there have already been questions in the chat that need to be addressed, would you mind simply reading them out? No, they're not. Okay, excellent. All right. We are all still here. Excellent. If you have any questions, feel free to chime in through your microphone or put your questions in the chat. Up to you. I'm all ears, people. Looks like I've answered all your questions in advance.
Can I ask,
Kevin, yes, please.
what does GMC stand for?
It stands for goal, motivation, conflict. And more than that, I will not tell. Spoilers. Actually, it's not really spoilers. There's a book called GMC. So if you really wanted to, you could check out the book yourself. It's
Okay.
quite good. And I'll be at least partially using it as one of the resources for during the course.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, splendid. It's good to be speaking with you, Deacon Kotar.
You as well.
I have a question, and perhaps you're not the person to answer this, so if that's the case, that's fine.
Okay.
I'm in the preliminary stages of a graphic novel, and I very much want to the extent possible, write in the tradition of the Inklings in the medium I'm working in.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think the kinds of things we'll be covering in this upcoming course, Motivating Your Lazy Characters, and also the St. Basil's workshop, will be transferable to a medium other than written fiction?
Yeah, no, I am the person to answer that question. First off, you will have access to someone who has published graphic novels in the tradition of the Inklings, and that would be Jonathan Pajot with God's Dog. So he could directly answer that question within the course itself. But what I will say is this: we've in the course of the first year's instruction, it's become clear, I think, to all of us in conversation with each other and in conversation with occasional visiting professors and other lecturers that come in through St. Basil's, that the future of storytelling need not necessarily be the novel. It could be any number of other things. It could be a multimedia type of storytelling. It could be music. It could be graphic novels. It could be comics. It could be it could be movies. It could be streaming. It could be anything. So the thing that is going to kind of become stratospheric and become the next cultural moment that really begins to turn people back away from the nonsense and the distraction back towards themselves and their own hearts, who knows what it's going to be. The principles are universal because they come from the deep traditions of storytelling that Tolkien talks about in his wonderful essay on fairy stories. They basically come from the hearth. They come from the deep past when we all sat together on fires and told stories to each other. So it doesn't matter what the medium is. You're going to get a lot of really wonderful instruction, especially in St. Basil's, because St. Basil's is going to have courses that are specifically geared towards the technique of writing, but it also addresses sort of the life of the writer in a very deep and profound way, allowing you to practice setting up writing rituals, accessing your spiritual life, and allowing for yourself to become a more holistic writer who doesn't simply write from the head but also from the heart. These are things that you're not going to find in other places. But in terms of motivating your lazy characters, the principles of goal, motivation, conflict, and scenes and sequels, you find them in all movies. You find them in all books. You find them in all comics. They are universal. So you absolutely can learn from this, even if you're a graphic novelist. Absolutely. So Sarah Creek has a question. How can I really hone in on an idea? Part of my problem is that critical voice inside. So overcoming critical voice and allowing creative voice to flourish is one of the key components of St. Basil's workshop. You learn how to do this both from a technique standpoint and from a spiritual life standpoint. And you have teachers addressing each one of those in very deep and profound ways. So how? I can't answer that question for you in a quick and easy way, except to tell you that there are certain things that you can definitely do even today. In particular, I'll just tell you, set up a writing ritual for yourself. How? Well, It's in the course. You'll find out, but you can look it up online. For myself, the thing that I find most important and the thing that really helps free my critical voice, because my creative voice, sorry, because my critical voice actually has a recognizable sound. Like I can hear the actual intonation. It's a woman, uh, and I can hear the intonation. I can hear the emotions. It's very specific, and so I know when critical voice is quiet because I can't hear that specific intonation. How do I get critical voice to be quiet? Through writing rituals. It is about setting boundaries between regular life, which is all about admin stuff, homework, taking care of kids, cooking, and the place where you are delving into the dreamscape and writing for the soul. How do you create that separation, that little barrier? Well, there's different ways of doing it. Different writers do it in different ways. The really important thing is to engage your senses in as many ways as you can to make that shift clear to your brain, because your brain is a lazy bastard, excuse me for my French, and doesn't want to change. And writing is a difficult change, especially if you're going to write freely, if you're going to get to that state of flow where things just go. It takes time, but if you get to a point where you can engage the entire body in a series of actions, could be simply going from one room to another. It could be changing the lighting in a room, could be lighting a candle, could be turning some music on, could be making a coffee from a specific cup. It could be all those things together. You have to try it out in different ways and stick to something that makes you feel good for a while so that the brain gets used to the idea that this is something that is not dangerous. And that really can help free you. But that's a small little technique thing. In terms of getting really deep into that, that's really what we're going to be talking about it in St. Basil's. Anna says, which we actually did at the St. Basil kickoff retreat, sat around the fire and told stories. Yes. Yes, dystopian fiction. Well, I think dystopian fiction may be the kind of fiction that tells the most truth about our times these days. So that's wonderful. All right, Ashlyn is asking, my mom wants to know if my sister will be able to stay with me during the retreat if I'm able to get into the workshop, even though she's not interested in participating herself, because my parents are worried about me possibly traveling alone. Yeah, I'm open to that arrangement. It shouldn't be an issue. In terms of logistics, there's probably enough room in the place that we're going to rent to allow for one or two people to come as support staff. So yeah, I think that shouldn't be a problem. But obviously we can talk about that when we get closer to the dates. Yes, yes, Sarah, exactly. Kind of like being in the icon corner, light, candle, incense, icon, slow down. Exactly. Yeah. Is it some possible? Evelyn asks, is it possible for someone to audit the course with the discount that you mentioned tonight, or for that matter, the St. Basil workshop? I am a teenager, but may have published work by the end of this year. We decided not to allow auditing at this point for St. Basil's. For motivate your lazy characters, I'm not even sure what auditing would look like because it's an online course, right? So it's I suppose that an auditing version would be kind of like a listening to the recordings afterwards. Well, I'm suppose I'm open to having a non-live version go on sale at some point, but I'd have to think about that, Evelyn.
Deacon, if I may
Yes,
ask
Kevin,
another question.
Yeah, please.
So you brought up in your presentation, you brought up Jane Austen, for example, and you had like War and Peace and Great Gatsby in one of your slides. And like in my mind, there's been kind of a split happening between like that kind of literary fiction, so to speak, and the kind of that they're clearly more focused on, the Tolkien Lewis line.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little about like rejoining those lines or when they split.
Well, I have some very particular opinions on this, and if you want the long version, I have an essay that's available on my website called I call it my Writers Manifesto. So if you look up Nicholas Kotar Writer Manifesto, you'll get the long and tortured version of it. But without recourse to any scholarship and without pretending to be absolutely accurate, my sense of this is something like this. In the 19th century saw the golden age of the realistic novel, but those realistic novels were written with commercial techniques. Charles Dickens, George Eliot, Dostoevsky wrote in an absolutely populist genre. I mean, detective fiction was looked down upon by nearly everybody before Dostoevsky put his pen to it. So on the one hand, it's realistic fiction. It's literary because, well, it's also literary because there's distance between us and them. So it sounds to us like it's more highfalutin or whatever, right? But at the time, it would have been elite fiction, certainly, but it wouldn't have been looked on it during that time as something that is, New York only, ivory tower only, uh, apply here after you've paid a certain amount of dues to high class, whatever, right? It was, whoever could read tended to enjoy um, that fiction, right? So it's not the dichotomy nowadays between literary and genre. It's somewhat strained and has to do more with stuff that happened in the 20th century. I think it has to do more with the fact that the realistic novel after the war stopped doing what it did before. Before the realistic novel was um, really interested in either remedying the sins of society, or it was interested in dealing with the sins of the person, and it was very deeply steeped in Christian thought, all of it. After the war, all that stuff starts to really kind of, I mean, read Death in Venice. That's a wonderful example of it. It's like the disintegration of everything that had held together society for centuries. And so the result of that, it happened to be that the realistic novel became an exercise in extreme self-introspection for very unlikable characters. So the kinds of books that start winning Nobel Prizes are books that are very finely written, but they're not as universally applicable or as pleasant or as transformative as the books were in the 19th century, because they were written for a different reason. Dickens wrote to change the world. Austen wrote, I don't know why she wrote, but I'm really glad she did, because she opened up an incredible world of the human psyche, of the human heart, in ways that really nobody ever did before. Um, but in the 20th century, like, things start getting confusing. The world wars cracked a lot of people's foundations, spiritual and philosophical foundations. Yeah, and the Nabokov is an example of that. Absolutely. And Nabokov is all about gorgeous literature talking about pedophilia. I mean, not all, but like, if we're talking about Lolita, I mean, there you go, right? It's this incredibly crafted sentence to talk about a very depraved individual. Um, it was about shocking people. Of course, it was about trying to get them to get out of the torpor that was perhaps an inevitable result of being in two world wars. But it doesn't make for the kind of experience of reading that you had in the 19th century. So when Tolkien comes along and opens up a window to seeing the world in a different way, in a more enchanted way, in a way that's less obsessed with, you know, the particular vices of the self, it was like opening a window into a dark room. Everybody went for that. So I think we're just in a moment where that kind of fiction is still very effective because it bypasses all of that head stuff where realistic fiction is right now, still to this point. And it goes straight and cuts to the heart of things by using fairy tale techniques. Uh, and that's really what we're trying to do here. We're trying to awaken people's hearts. We're trying to animate their love for beautiful things and for God, hopefully. And that's hard. That's harder to do with realistic fiction when people are so erudite, people are so well read that their antenna are up as soon as you try to do anything. And if it's smacks of any kind of transformative, they're like, give me that jaded, cynical stuff, please. So something like that. But again, this is just my personal opinion. And no, in no way am I quoting some experts on the matter, but this certainly it's how it seems to me. And Mel says, I saw a documentary that made a case that Jane Austen was actually poking fun at societal happenings. Oh, she certainly was. There's no doubt. But you can poke fun and also love it, right? You can poke fun at the thing you love, and at the end, you can still kind of embrace it, and warts and all, and kind of come to love it. She's very multi-layered. So her books, according to some scholars, are actually sort of comedy, which is hard to see from a moral perspective. Yeah, no, they definitely are. She's poking fun at at a type of person, a type of character, a type of society. But in the end, actually, come to think of it, there are certain ways of reading Pride and Prejudice that for myself, last time I read Pride and Prejudice, I came away thinking that perhaps she had pulled the wool over our heads, and actually, this is a very cynical novel about making sure that you take care of yourself financially, because there's a way of looking at Lizzie's love for Darcy in entirely mercenary terms. And she even says it. Lizzie even says it, and she laughs about it. But there's a way of reading it just to think Jane Austen is just poking everybody and laughing in her little corner. So, but I think there are multiple ways of reading Jane Austen. Each one of them is quite enriching, which is not something you can say for a lot of modern fiction. Any more questions? It is getting a bit late, and I've been torturing you all.
Deacon,
Yes, go ahead.
might I ask another question?
Please, yes.
So I've had this inkling, pun intended, I suppose, that if you were to look at, say, um, the narrative structure St. Gregory of Nyssa kind of outlines in Life of Moses,
Yeah.
in addition to something like St. Maximus's Ecclesiastical Mystagogy,
Yeah.
and something like St. Germanus's On the Divine Liturgy, and you were to kind of triangulate with those three, you get a pretty good sense for the shape your story should have in kind of structural terms.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had a similar thought? Do you think that's off base?
No, I don't think it's that off base. I'm not sure that it's all that useful to try to extrapolate a writing structure from those specific writings of the fathers. What I mean, maybe it is. I can only talk about myself. What really astounds me in reading particularly those works is just how much they confirm a lot of the ways that humanity has developed in terms of storytelling structures and styles. So the basically those books are about the structure of reality. Those books are about how the world unfolds itself, how we experience the world, and how we can come to experience it more deeply. And in that journey of coming to experience the world more deeply, we recognize that actually it is a 3-act structure. So what's going on there is not so much, I think, that you need to kind of go into those works and then take out specific textual cues for techniques, because they're not about that, right? But rather read them and then be confirmed in the fact that we are blessed as storytelling creatures, because in the process of writing the story, we are in some sense reenacting for our readers the process of coming to know reality at a deeper level. And by doing it vicariously, we're showing them a way that they could do it in their real life, in their own lives, which is, I think, a very important thing to consider, because this is something that a lot of people don't agree with. A lot of modern thinkers do not allow for the possibility that reading can have a direct influence on living. And the reason being that they have particular fantasies that they like to engage in reading. This is especially true of a lot of certain romance genres. And I can say this because I've been reading a lot of craft books written by romance authors. And it is absolutely undeniably true that the really successful 7-figure type authors, the ones who really manage to get the constant cash cows, are leaning into passions, are leaning into agitating the passions of their readers. This is an absolutely, they themselves will say it. In fact, there's in a book I recently read, there's a subheading in a chapter called morality to taste. In other words, you decide what your morality is based on what you're comfortable with, not based on what is right, but what you're comfortable with, because you are providing a particular kind of fantasy experience for your reader, and it's okay because it's safe. And I'm like, who told you it's safe? How do you know it's safe? Because everything that I know about myself and I know about other people around me is that it is not safe, and that reading is such a powerfully internal experience that it absolutely, in fact, does translate into your own life. But this is a reality. A lot of people will not accept the fact that reading has a direct influence on action. So that being the case, we knowing it to be the case, that's really where the writings of the fathers can be super, super useful, because they demonstrate to you the reality of that. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
So yeah, read those fathers for sure, but read them and try to understand what the fathers are telling you about your spiritual life. And if there is something that resonates with the writing process, thank God, use it. But I would not read those books with an eye to extrapolating a process from them, because that's not why they were written. So that's what I'm trying to get at. because you're not going to get as much out of them, if you read them that way. Yeah.
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
So if you wanted to make a living as a writer, then
Yeah.
I guess if all the money's in the passions, how can you make
That's
money
an
on your
excellent
writing?
question. The answer is you can do it. It just takes longer and it's harder. I'm a living example of the fact that it can be done. I am now a full-time writer. My writing is the thing that financially supports me, so it can be done. There are different ways of doing it. We will be going into publishing paths and publishing approaches in St. Basil's this coming year. I will tell you that this is a question that I am deeply immersed in right now, because St. Basil's is going to have a publishing arm attached to it. We're already planning it. So the question of how can I help other writers become financially independent on their writing is one that is dear to my heart, because ideally what I would love to see is an ecosystem where a very good writer can submit his work or her work, and that work can then enter into an existing ecosystem where the readers are ready and willing and anxious for the next transformative story to come. So use Amazon's own model of the recommendation algorithm, but use it as, plundering the barbarians, use it in such a way to recommend good stories within the existing ecosystem. So that's a lot of technobabble to say that what I'm hoping will happen in the next 5-10 years is a kind of online space where readers will know that's the kind of book where that's the place where I will find the kind of book that is like The Lord of the Rings, that is like Narnia. So instead of going to Amazon and looking at categories, they'll go to this other place because they know that it's a safe place, because they know that there are new writers coming there every day that are being published who are telling those kinds of stories. And what I hope will happen is that the audience will keep coming and keep coming and keep coming. And when the audience is there, then the ecosystem itself will become the vehicle by which authors can become financially independent and successful. That's the overarching vision. More practically speaking, the way you become in this particular moment is by cultivating relationships with readers directly, not through a publisher, is by making sure the readers can recognize you personally on the internet, and getting them to a point where they're willing and able and happy to buy from you directly, whether that's through Kickstarter or through your email list or through social media or live at conventions or at talks or things like this. It is possible. It just takes time. The other way, the 7-figure way of leading into the fantasies, you can get rich very quickly. But it's a really interesting thing that happens to a lot of those writers in those spaces. They burn out very quickly. They get to a point where they can't continue writing those kinds of stories because it takes a toll on you. It takes an emotional and spiritual toll on you to keep churning that stuff out. Because if as a writer you have to live through all that stuff, if you're writing effectively, you are feeling those emotions. You're feeling those things. It's a dangerous thing. So does that answer your question, Maxwell?
Yes, thank you.
Welcome. It's akin to method acting. Yeah, it is actually. Yeah. We know what happened to poor Heath Ledger. Yeah. Well, if that's it, we're gonna start wrapping up. I hope to see. I know some of you have already purchased the course. I'm happy to see you here. Hopefully, this was informative. The classes will be more in depth, obviously. And those of you who have not signed up yet, you have till midnight for the 25% off. Don't forget. The code is in the chat, not the code, the link and the code. So yeah, I hope to see you there. It's going to be really fun. I haven't taught a live class like this in a while. I really enjoy it. So we already have a good group coming. So I hope you all will join as well. And I hope to see your names in the applications starting in January 2024. Yes, and Anna, thank you for putting that link in again. Wonderful. Don't forget that code. Thanks, everybody. It's lovely to see you. Again, apologies for the early technical difficulties. I'm glad to see you all stuck around. It's a good sign that you can go through the toll houses and make it to the sweet ending. All right, everybody. Hope you have a good evening, and hopefully I'll see some of you or all of you next week when you get started. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
God bless.
You too.